Good afternoon. I hope everyone is doing well as we begin a new, phase two. We're going to be doing phase two of James today. It'll be pretty exciting. Just really enjoy the book of James. Last week we covered, of course, an introduction to the book, or the letter, from James, the possible half-brother of Jesus. And we went through, I guess it was the first 8 verses of chapter 1. And those of you who followed with me before know that we sometimes take a little bit of time as we go verse to verse as we go through the scripture, which, again, I find to be very important and significant. It may sometimes feel like a drag to some, but it's very significant to be able to understand exactly, well, we can never understand exactly what they were trying to say, but to have a better understanding of what the writers were trying to communicate, not only to us, but most likely what they were communicating to the people they were writing to 2,000 years ago. In James' case, it was the church in Jerusalem. He remained there while Peter and Paul went off to other parts of the regions of Judea and surrounding area. And James remained in Jerusalem to work with the Messianic Jews, as well as those who continued to be just regular Jews, everyday Jews, and continued to worship and lead and guide that group of people. As you can see through this letter, as we've gone through the first 8 verses, and we'll continue to go through that, there are some issues that were going on in the early church in Jerusalem, and there's stuff that James, of course, was trying to address. He was writing specifically to this group, but the good thing for us is that we can take a lot of the information that he posted during that time and apply it to our own lives, and to be able to use that. So there's a lot of wisdom in what James has written here, and that is actually referred to for the New Testament is referred to as a wisdom book, and so that's very fitting for what it is. So we're going to start today in chapter 1, verse 9, and try to get our way through the rest of chapter 1, and then have a discussion on that. And then if things go really crazy, which I seriously doubt they will, we'll start chapter 2 and move on from there. But to begin, let's look at verses 9 through 11, and then we'll have a little discussion about what's going on, and then continue to move on through the rest of the verses here. So here we go. Verse 9, chapter 1 of James. But the brother of humble circumstances is to glory in his high position, and the rich man is to glory in his humiliation, because like flowering grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with a scorching wind and withers the grass, and its flower falls off, and beauty of its appearance is destroyed. So too the rich man in the midst of his pursuits will fade away. As you guys know, during that time, the socioeconomic conditions was very, there's a huge divide between the rich and the poor, and in the context in which James lived and to the people he was writing to. A lot of the people who chose to become Messianic Jews lost a lot of their livelihood, and many of the people in the first early church were poor. And the reason, and the church actually drew a lot of poor people in because they had no other hope besides in this Christ that James writes about, as well as what Paul writes about and others writers see. And that's why there's such a draw to the gospel, is because there is a hope that the people who were poor did not have. That was in their view, that was their only way out. I mean, this Christ must be able to provide something that we cannot get on our own, salvation or whatever it is they were looking for. That was something they were trying to do. Another way to look at it is there were many Messianic Jews who chose this path, this way, as we've heard it called before, and they lost their livelihoods. They lost their family connections because they were either disowned by their families, or their businesses were shut down because those who were in power did not like this new way and would try to abolish it however they could. Now, of course, the Romans played a role in here, but a lot of the stuff that James is dealing with is related to how other Hebrew or other Jewish people were trying to either oppress or keep down the Messianic Jews and these new believers. And so as we look at verse 9, there's some we just finished the contrast in the earlier verses, the contrast of a double-minded versus single-minded man and or individual. We got to think here. James was actually writing in non-gender specific through a lot of this. He was the double-minded man who could not make decisions, or who was kind of flopping from one side to the other. He talked about the waves kind of getting tossed around. That person versus single-minded in Christ, and who Christ is, who is single-minded. And now we're coming into a little different situation here with those who are either humble circumstances, oppressed circumstances, depending on your translation. There's a couple ways to look at that. So it could be either financial or spiritual lowliness that they're dealing with, depending on how we look at this context. Again, like I said, these are he refers to him as brother here, but if you looked at the original text, it's not gender specific, so you could look at it more as brothers and sisters who are lowly in spirit or of humble circumstances as we look through this. Like I said, this is a socioeconomic conversation, and they were not only dealing with low-income situations, people not being able to feed themselves or feed their families. They're also dealing with low spiritual standing as well, where they were either kicked out of their old families or lifestyles. They're in a new, not necessarily religion, but new way of believing that, as you can imagine, in a community like this would make you feel pretty lonely or pretty dark on the spiritual side. As we continue on here into verse 10, actually we'll continue through 9 and 10. We're looking at the boasting that he refers to is related to a type of joy. They're to boast in the economic tests and deprivations that they were dealing with, and to see how they'll be formed and come out the other end. So you have to think about, what is this doing for this person as they're going through it. I mean, this is transformative time for them as they decide to be people of a kind of a new faith, following this Christ and going in that direction. So they're dealing with that. We're not looking at an eschatological viewpoint or an ultimate destiny for somebody at this point. Well, if you think of it, James is not speaking of a destiny of eternity with Jesus. He is speaking of what he mentioned earlier, the movement of a maturation process from who they were to who God had intended them to be. You can think of it as the raising up in like a moral formation and also in wisdom, because of course James is a wisdom book. As we continue to go on here, let's look into verse 10. The rich men are those who treat the poor unjustly. These are men and women. I mean, you got to look at it that way. Here it is specifically talking about men, but if you go back and look at the history of that time, there were just as many wealthy women who were oppressing the poor as there were men. So we want to make sure that this is brought about as being pretty even. And these people who are like this will be warned of injustice later on in James about what they're dealing with and what they're doing. The Jewish priestly establishment could also be who James is referring to here. We know they were not always on the up and up, that the priests, if we go all the way back for centuries, you'll see that the priests in many cases were just as unjust as other people, even though they were supposed to be completely different here. Just to kind of a little bit of a symbolism here when looking at the flowering, the use of it could be, the use of this here is like flowering grass, they will pass away. The flower could be a symbol of who the rich people are, the people who are not performing manual labor, the people who are oppressing the poor. The flower is a familiar symbol that was used throughout the Old Testament. And if you were to turn to Psalm 90, chapter 90, verse 36 in Psalm, you would see that there's a good example of a flower reference here. The word glory is not in the original Greek. It was in this verse. It was added later on. This could be a continuation of the word glory at the beginning of the sentence, and so it was just kind of kind of added as we go through this, because you have to look at this here. It's 9 and 10 is actually one sentence, so there's that continuation of thought as we go through this. There's also an understanding of this as well. Whatever the glory they have on earth, it will fade away. So whatever wealth they have on earth will fade away. So you have to look at it that way as well. And another way to see this is everything that they've accomplished here on earth, anything they've accumulated here on earth, of course, will pass away as well. That kind of comes across pretty obvious in that part of it. As we look at verse 11, the flower grass analogy continues here. James is using this symbolism for the people who are either reading or hearing this for the first time will understand. Of course, they'll understand this reference probably better than many of us because they were in an agrarian society and existed and subsisted on agriculture, and so to see stuff like this, they very much got this picture. Much like when Jesus would do agricultural references in his parables, people got that because that's where they lived. He would probably do different parables today if it was a different context than he existed today in our current society, and the same for the other writers here as we go through this. So they know what flowers look like. They know what it's like in full splendor, and the flowers eventually turn into fruit, but eventually everything withers away and everything like that happens. And so they all very much understand how this all works. In this way, so whenever you look at that, the usage of in this way that the writer uses here in verse 11, the word is otos in Greek, what it shows us here, it will have the same outcome, so that the same sort of pursuits of wealth will have the same outcome for all these people. The pursuits here can not only have to be financial pursuits, but you can also look at it as a journey or a trip. So the wealthy people, they go about their life, their way of life, their journey as they go through their life, their way of life will fade away. So it's not just they're sitting there and their money disappears one day, but the way they lived will disappear. However they were oppressing other people will disappear. That will no longer be true. And so the person who's reading this must be humble in his understanding of how this is all going to go down eventually as it moves forward. Let's continue to look here, and I'm going to read verses 12 through 18 as we continue this conversation, or this part of the letter that James is providing about just kind of the blessed versus the humble and the wealthy versus the poor, as he continues this related to trials. And so in verse 12 here of chapter 1, you have, blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. In the exercise of his will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, so that we would be a kind of first fruits among his creatures. So James continues on through his explanation here, starting to deal with trials. From here through the rest of this section of Scripture, we see how God relates to trials, and of course how humans will relate to trials as well. Now that we have an understanding of the fate of the poor and the rich man, we return to James' original point of persevering under trials. So we had kind of a quick break there between the rich and the poor, and now we're coming back to trials and how people will deal with trials. As we look at verse 12 here, the blessed or unfortunate, or blessed or also probably just the fortunate person, is similar to what you'd see in Luke 6:22. Blessed are you when men hate you and ostracize you and insult you and scorn your name as evil for the sake of the Son of Man. same sort of idea here. The perseverance is more than just they had a bad day. It's they have a bad life. A lot of bad things are constantly going on. It is the existence under an oppressive regime for where they are hated for what they believe in. They've lost their jobs. They've lost their livelihood. They've lost their families. It's more than just having a bad day and someone cut you off in traffic or said something you didn't like on Facebook. There's a lot more to this perseverance that they're having to deal here. Again, just because I like to bring this up, the usage of man here is not gender specific, so you got to think of it more as blessed is a man and woman, or man or woman, who perseveres under trial. The word is ener, and then in Greek it is not gender specific at this point. Approved, for once he has been approved, you got to think of it as probably more like he passed the test or is tested, to come to a point of passed or being tested. And then as we continue on, this love, it's at the end of verse 12, you have a agaposin type love. You probably heard of agape love, which is an extremely deep love, but just the usage here of how it's done grammatically is more something like agaposin, which again, an extreme deep love that is being shown here. A willingness to forfeit. It's so bad that you're willing to die for somebody, willing to forfeit your rights and privileges on behalf of another person. That's the type of love that has been promised through here. So it's a very deep love, and there's multiple versions of love that's used throughout the New and Old Testament actually, and this one is probably the strongest love. It's the one that really kind of shows what it is to lay down your life or to sacrifice in a very deep way. Verse 13, let no one say when he is tempted. Again, that can probably better read, if you want to say it that way. It could be tested. Let no one say when he is tested, I am being tested by God. Nobody can declare at this point actually, or tell someone else when they are put to the test, as in you or I cannot say. The people who are reading this letter cannot really say that. God cannot be tested by evil people, and if depending on your viewpoint, we're all evil in some aspect. More specifically, moral or objectionable behavior is probably another way to look at it here. So instead of just evil, morally or objectionable behavior related to that as we look through this. Another way to think about this is God does not put anyone to the test. It is not in God's character, and this is a whole other debate. You could have multiple books have been written on this about what's God's character, and is it in his character to be able to test people with evil. If God is not able to if God is all good, there's no evil in God, so how can he test with someone evil? I mean, there's so much debate around this that there's theologians, philosophers, you name it, who have been debating this for centuries. We're not going to go into it today, but there's just a lot of interest there. We're going to go with the idea that, and the viewpoint that it is not in God's character to test people with evil. And then those of you who are really listening is like, well, God tests with things that aren't evil, and again, it's a huge conversation that's not within the format of this conversation today. As we continue on into verse 14, but each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Everyone as individuals can be tempted. It's an individual experience, and individual choices are made at that point, even in groups. The group does not tempt individuals. It's you have to allow it yourself to happen. I believe that's what James is saying here, is that there may be things that are tempting to you, and there are activities or events or things that are around you that are tempting, but it is ultimately up to you how you respond to what you think is a temptation or is a temptation for you. No one can force you to be tempted by something, is how I am reading this. So you got to think of this more as an individual experience and decision that lures us to the temptation, We could be lured to something, but we ultimately, and we could be entrapped in our own desires, but it's ultimately our decision on how we act on those desires is what we see here. One's own decision allows for the temptation of evil is one way to think about that. This is our own decision to fall into our own cravings. God does not create the cravings, as in that regard. We do. Satan doesn't even create those. Sometimes I think we blame Satan on way too many things. It's within our own character as humans to make bad choices. That's probably the best way to say it. Satan is not omnipresent, omniscient. He is not everywhere. So to say that everything that happens bad to you is caused by Satan is, I think, misguided. To say that Satan may have had a hand in it, it's possible, but probably misguided too. I would probably more think of it as that you live in a human history and you're put into part of human history where sin has been going on for centuries, and you are now part of that history, and decisions of the past can cause things to happen now. Decisions in the past can cause good and evil to happen, and now you're part of that, and how you respond to that is a big piece of it. I think it's a cop-out, to be honest, that a lot of people say, Satan caused me to do that, or Satan tempted me to do it. I think, no, actually, that was your choice to do that. So be happy to debate that, or not debate. Debating's silly, but discuss, because it's something that there's a lot of good things that I think can come out of that. As we continue to go on into verse 15 and the following, notice the order of activities that we start seeing here. We have a conception all the way through to birth. Lust is a sin. Let's go back. So there's a gestation period between conception and truth. They had a choice to pursue their lusts and cravings. Lust is a sin. We do not have to pursue those lusts or desires. Satan does not make us. We make that decision. Now, if Satan could make us, that's a whole other conversation of the control which he doesn't have. We personify Satan like it's a him. It doesn't have over us. We do the same thing with God. But anyways, when we commit a sin, think of sin as a feeling that transgresses something forbidden or ignoring something that is required by God's law. This could be a thought, a feeling, a speech, or action. And then, of course, the brings forth means, of course, to give birth. So we have that happening, this process happening here from conception to death there in verse 15. And then as we continue on into 16, we're not to be led to be led astray or misled. This is a fine warning from James. If you look at it, do not be deceived, my beloved brothers and sisters. Beloved is using a form of agape. So again, we're seeing James is showing a deep love for the people that he's writing to. This shows us from the writer that there's a deep connection that he has with his community, that he cherishes and dearly loves these people as he writes to them and provides them this insight. Brethren could also be used, besides just brothers and sisters, also be used, of course, pointing to one's own siblings, which, based on the context of this, he's writing beyond just his own siblings. It could also be fellow countrymen or country people. But then again, I think you also see it, of course, here as brothers and sisters in Christ, or brothers and sisters, or fellow brothers and sisters, fellow believing brothers and sisters. So he deeply loves those that are not only there in Jerusalem, but everyone else who would read this letter that are now faithful followers who have been dispersed. And, they're all, ultimately what he's trying to show them here is that they're all in the same boat, and they all have the same opportunity to be deceived. And it's up to them to have the wisdom and to be transformed in Christ, not to be deceived, and to live more as they were, as God had intended them to live. As we go into verse 17, every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above. Perfect meaning not as in a perfection, but think of it as more of being complete. We see this used in Old and New Testament, where we sometimes see the word perfect, and we will take that incorrectly, but think of it more as it's the whole package of being complete, fully developed. You could You could also go as far and say fully developed without blemish or defect, which again, then you could say, well, that's perfect, right? Well, it is, but think of it more as this is a maturation process, again, that we're going through and becoming fully developed, as we see here in verse 17. And only God can send perfection. Only God can provide such a gift as this, is what we see here. And another way to look at this, we have from the Father of lights. In God, it is light. I mean, again, we're providing earthly words to who God is, because that's all we can do. And so we have to have this comparison of light and darkness. So God is light in the darkness. If you look in there's no darkness in God. It's again going back to the nature of God, is there's no darkness, so there's no evil. It's all good. God is all good. If you looked at, say, 1 John 1 through 5, something to the effect of, this is the message we have heard from him and announced to you, that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. So not that James is necessarily referring or referencing 1 John 1 through 5, but what we know here through verse 17 is God's character cannot change and will not change. He is perfect, complete, and without defect. And we are moving in that direction through our maturing process, through our own perfection, to get to that point, to be complete in who God made us to be. Not that we will ever be God, but to be who God intended us to be. And then in verse 18, in this next section, as we finish up this second section here, in the exercise of his will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, so that we would be a kind of first fruits among his creatures. See the beginning here as by his sovereign will, his wish, he had through his wish, through God's sovereign will, he has given birth, brought forward through the message of the law, or the Torah, his will and truth, his conformity to reality of what he always wanted the Jewish people to do. He wanted them to be a separated group, a separated nation, and they failed at that miserably. And that's why Jesus had to come to help kind of reconcile all that and bring it all back together. But we're still moving towards God's sovereign will and God's desires are for his creation. If you look again as we go through here, first fruits, the kind of people that would or have not defiled or are without blemish. This is, of course, an Old Testament reference to the sacrifices and the time of that time. We as people are the first fruits. No other creature has been brought forth at this level or at this status. So there's kind of a separation, as that we would be a kind of first fruits among his creatures. So setting humans above other creatures through this as well. And so James is just trying to make a point of that as we move forward with this. All right, as we continue on, verse 19. Chapter 1, verse 19. This you know, my beloved brethren, but everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. Therefore, putting aside all filthiness and all that remains of wickedness, and humility receives the word implanted, which is able to save your souls. But prove yourselves doers of the word, and not merely hearers of who delude themselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks at his natural face in a mirror. For once he has looked at himself and gone away, he has immediately forgotten what kind of person he was. But one who looks intently at the perfect law, the law of liberty, and abides by it, not having become a forgetful hearer, but an effectual doer, this man will be blessed in what he does. If anyone thinks himself to be religious and yet does not bridle his tongue but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless. Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the word. And so we continue on here with James and how they're kind of living under You got to remember, as they're going through this, they're living through continue to live through a time of economic depression or oppression. We get 3 commands about speech as we continue to go into verse 19. And we get a reason for the 3 commands, and then a sum up of the 3 commands that we get as we go through this last part of chapter 1. And as we continue to look at here, the first fruits. Oh, wait, I already did first fruits. I'm not sure why I said that again. Actually, let's talk about that. The first fruits in verse 18 are to live together. So he is making a reference back to the first fruits. So those of us who are set aside, those of us who are believers, who are bringing ourselves to God, that Old Testament reference. We're to live together in a community of justice. And what they were doing during this time was living in a community that was not a community of justice. Those who were supposed to be helping them, leading them, and guiding them were doing the exact opposite as what they were dealing with. Those they were supposed to be able to trust, they were not able to trust because they were being deceived by them. And so you have that reference back to them as we go through this. The idea here as we go into this is that the people who will be redeemed by God, so we're kind of dealing with an eschatological conversation here, reminds those who are being oppressed not to go after others who are oppressing them, not to seek revenge. These are real people in real situations that we're dealing with here, and there was that temptation, and James is dealing with this temptation as he works through this, for people not to go back after people who've come after them, not to oppress them. And it goes the same. That's just good wisdom for our own day. Is if you're someone who has been oppressed or someone has come after you or taken you out, James is trying to help them to realize that to seek revenge and the way they were trying to seek revenge in an evil, angry way is not good for them. It's not good for the community, and was not going to be good long term for anyone. The reason he brings this up, of course, and the reason any writer would bring this up, and why we see it in other parts of, especially if you look at Paul's letters, is that James had a concern that in the community there were people in there who wanted to disrupt the community, to threaten the justice, the integrity, and the security of everything of those people at that time. And so he knew that was going on. The idea of quick to listen or quick to hear is dealing with a self-control. Pertains to, if you think of to control of desires that have led to conflicts and disputes. They wanted to do that. We'll see James approaches this again a little bit later on in the letter, but what he wants them to do is wants him to listen to those in the community who are wise, listen or value the law or the Torah that has been brought to them, and that he should know and they should reflect on that and reflect on those leaders. There were some good priests and some good leaders reflect on their wisdom as they go through this. The idea of slow to speak means not, for the most part, not to shoot your mouth off, is what he's trying to say, to not react to verbal confrontations in a way that is not edifying, in a way that could tear down someone else, in a way that could continue to disrupt the community. We have to also think of what we have here is slow to anger, wanting them to avoid any additional conflicts and disputes. Again, James is bringing this back to them of how they are to live, not to be a reflection of the oppression and anger within their community, but to be the light in which God has provided them and reflects from them to be. So ultimately, you can think of this from a different way. From a spiritual side, James is trying to help them mature in their process, in their process of growing and maturing and transforming and being transformed of who they are. And then the other side of what James is trying to do is trying to keep from big riots from happening and from the whole community from blowing up on itself. And so there's kind of a two parts that he's trying to fix here as we go through this. As we go into verse 20, we have the word righteousness, meaning the righteousness that God desires. Verse 20, for the most part, brings about the reasoning behind the commands in verse 19. The anger that we have here is an intense anger that, again, what James is trying to avoid. This anger is extremely intense, and an anger that disrupts communities, destroys lives. Again, this is more than just being a bit frustrated or angry because someone, again, cut you off in traffic, or cut you off in line at the store, or took the last roll of toilet paper at HEB 6 weeks ago. So anyways, it's one of those things there's a lot more to that than many times what we think of anger. This is an extreme anger that would disrupt the community during this time. And then as James is telling this, he's contrasting their wrath with the righteousness that God desires. So they're being able to see this. The effects that are produced through this, or what is achieved through this anger, is inconsistent with God's righteousness, or the justice of God. Jesus judged people by their effects, or how they work through this. And if you were to turn to Matthew 7:21 through 23, you'd see an example of when he would talk about that. God's righteousness, or God's saving activity, grants a status of righteousness. The attribute of righteousness that has been given to God is what God is accomplishing here on earth. So to think about it that way, how this whole righteousness is working here. James is countering what many believe in that they can bring about God's righteousness through their anger. And I'm not sure if you've heard of that idea of it was a righteous anger. I'm gonna be so angry and so disruptive that because I want to fix something, right? Or I want to get back at that person because they were so evil to me or so mean to me. And they think that will allow for peace, or that God will approve of it, and that's not true. They cannot force God's righteousness. Our behavior is to conform with God's righteousness, not to be contrasted with God's righteousness. God's righteousness does not conform to our behavior. It's like, well, I believe in God and I read the Bible and I'm a good person. So God obviously agrees with what I'm saying. That's not at all what's being said here, and that's not at all what James would ever teach and what's ever taught in the Bible. Now, sometimes we'll take that as like, well, if I go to church on a regular basis, or I'm this denomination, then obviously God's on my side, and whatever I say, God's righteousness will be with me because I feel like I'm slightly above average in who I am as a person. I haven't killed anyone. Well, that's not all what James is saying here, is that our righteousness conforms with what God's expectations of us to be, and many times our normal response is opposite of what God would want us to do. So just think of it this way. God's righteousness does not conform to our behavior, no matter how righteous we think our behavior is. And then, of course, God's society, God's intention of his creation, what God, when we see the idea of a new heaven and new earth, does not come through actions of violence and force. And so that's a very small verse, but with a lot of information or explanation about what James is trying to say there. As we go into verse 21, we have the wickedness that is brought up, the evil that is so prevalent. You think of meekness, to humbly accept something. Meekness sometimes gets a bad rap, especially in our the way we like to define meekness. How they defined meekness back in the time of James was completely different than how we like to do it today. We like to think of it, I think a lot of people like to think of meekness as being weak or a pushover, but it's different than as more of a righteousness, to be able to humbly accept and to live within the righteousness in which God created us to live. And so you have to think of that. A clarification of two conditions that Paul brought up in verse 19 is what we have here as we start with this. Therefore, because of what you know and how you know you should act in God's righteousness, do this. Do what I'm about to say based on how you're supposed to act versus how you think you're supposed to act. And that's what we have here. So for people to communicate in both love and in justice, putting aside or ridding ourselves of which for the most part means to drawing on this idea of drawing on the early Christian tradition of purification and setting apart. We can think of that as baptism, possibly circumcision. I'm talking about early early Christians' traditions. We're to renunciate our devices and turn to a virtuous life as defined by God's righteousness. Is one thing that we see of what James is writing here about how we are to live. If we are to see how this relates to verse 19, we're looking at James speaking of verbal sins and anger that divides and hurts the community. Again, we're going back to how does our response affect the community in which we live in. That's not only just the town or city in which we live, or the apartment complex or neighborhood, but also the church community. How does our response to things, is it a righteous response that is edifying and is within God's righteousness, or is our own righteousness that we're then trying to place upon God as his own? And that's, of course, not what we're not supposed to be doing. Instead, we're to be, as we're seeing from James, we're to be meek and just in our dealings, both emotion and speech. You got to think of it as justice, peace, and love. We're to receive the word in meekness or humility. Some have referenced this to a reference to the Beatitudes from Matthew chapter 5 of a meek person or people. When you look at when you're looking at either meekness or humility, so it's more than just a moral virtue. It is probably instead is a reminder that the meek will inherit, of course, what we see from Matthew 5. The word receive can also be welcome or absorb or surrender to, letting the word have its way with our hearts so that a person can live within God's righteousness. We're about to enter a new section, verses 22 through 25. And what we have here is we have the need to hear and do with warning about deception. There's a warning about deception here. There we get a nice illustration thrown in, and then the need to hear and do with the promise of blessing. So as we begin here into verse 22, but prove yourselves doers of the word and not merely hearers who delude themselves. We're actually to do what the word tells us to do. So the word, they could have been referencing the Torah, other scripture. They could have been referencing Jesus, what Jesus taught while he was here on earth. There's different ways to look at it here. Ultimately to do what they have been taught by God to do, how they should live. The doers of the word are the peaceful ones, the people who have not become angry and volatile, who have not disrupted the community, the people he was referring to earlier on in earlier verses. Those who hear and do God's word will seek justice and live peacefully. That peacefully is a key part, especially for us nowadays in our dualistic, partisan culture, where we do not like to necessarily live peacefully unless that person agrees with us. So it's something that you'd have to think about as well. Those who are volatile and angry will never see justice through their anger. No matter how angry they get or how righteous their anger is, they'll never see peace, because that is not the intention of how we are to live. Jew of the word is consistent with what Jesus taught in Matthew 7, 12 through 27, as well as what we see Paul wrote in Romans chapter 2, verse 13. So we see that as well. As we continue to look at this here, the doers here, that do is a consistent directive in the Torah. You see that throughout the Torah. This verse is a very Jewish suggestion, or very Jewish thought in how James is writing this. So those Messianic Jews who are reading this would very much understand what he's trying to get at here. The emphasis, of course, here is on correct action is a key area of Judaism, and they were to do or perform the law. And so, even though Jesus said he had fulfilled the law, there's still a lot of Jewish traditions, a lot of Jewish wording that had and practices that were continuing to go on. And that they were to live in a certain way and understand what that meant to do, or how that was supposed to happen. So what we're dealing here is a convergence of Torah, Jewish law, and what of course, which is the Jewish law, and what Jesus taught, kind of forming into a new system of belief. It is the law of love God and love your neighbor. So if you go back into the Old Testament, where that was the Old Testament, where that commandment was given early on in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy 6, I believe, where you were to see that, to love God and to love your neighbor. Well, the neighbor part was added later. But so think about this here as the hearer and doer in the full context of this letter. They've persevered in maturation, and they've matured and been transformed. They're seeking God's wisdom in trials. They're avoiding impulses of violence, and they're pursuing God's justice, not their own or their version of God's justice, but God's justice. And as we continue on through this, if you're just hearing, so there's a difference between hearing and listening. I think as children we were taught that, and I think adults continue to this day are taught that there's a difference between hearing and listening. You can hear something, but that is what, as James is saying here, is deceptive, or it deludes people, because they're not. It's almost the difference between knowing and knowing, right? You know God and you know God. You know God as in a factual thing, as in there is a God, or there's a being who created the earth. There's a being that possibly created me. There's a knowing of facts, and then there's a knowing in a intimate relationship way, and that's the same thing that we have going on here. Of when you hear something, are you doing something with what you're hearing, or are you just kind of letting it pass by and keep on living how you want it to live? We cannot be part of God's will or establish God's will if we do not both hear and do. We're to think that we are being deceived if we just hear, or if we just do our own thing without listening to God or what God has called us to do. So we get a little bit more information as we go into verses 23 and 24. Think of this as someone that he's writing about here as who has seen who God wants them to be, or has seen the will of God for who they were created to be, but does not allow the image of God to shape them into who they are to be. So they've heard, but they haven't done anything with it. It hasn't become who they are, or isn't part of their transforming. It's not transforming them. This knowledge is not transformative for them. It's more of just facts at this point. So just kind of shallow, useless facts until it transforms them. You can also think of it as a person who sees their sinfulness but does nothing about it. So they know they live a life of sin. They know that they're maybe stuck in something that is causing sin, or they're so many examples you could give related to this. They know it's wrong. They know they're sinning. They know they're being deceptive. They know they're out of how God has intended them to be, out of God's will, but they continue to live the way they want to. And then this is more of you think of it as a moral reflection instead of a ontological, or an idea of who they are being as a being, or how they were existing, reflection on who we are. And then also, as we think about this, forgetting is a form of self-deception, which it is because you've forgotten, maybe saying that you've forgotten on purpose, or it has not changed you or transformed you. It has not allowed you to be who you were to be. So let's look at verse 25. But one who looks intently at the perfect law, the law of liberty, and abides by it, not having become a forgetful hearer, but an effectual doer, this man will be blessed in what he does. We now see what James was referring to as the word, going back to verse 22, which is the perfect law. Blessings will come upon that person. So now he's dealing with the law, so you got to think of it as the Torah. He abides by it. Could also be he perseveres by it. We see then, if you go to the perfect law and persevere, then you will be blessed. So we have a kind of if-then statement that James is providing here for us. To look intently is to be receptive or open to what is being said. This person who is receptive is mature and wise, who is not led by their own desires or their own impulses. They do not question God's goodness. They are not violent or abusive. This is a wise person of peace, seeking to do the word of God and bring God's justice to this earth. Again, not their version of God's justice, which many of us like to do. It is more of God's justice to here, God's righteousness to this earth. The perseverance is the person who sees what the law is and continues to practice the law over time. If you were to go back to Deuteronomy 27, you'd see a good example of that, so that people will have an understanding of who they are and who they are in the law. As we continue on here, we must see that the people who James is speaking to were committed Jews, and now are committed Messianic Jews. They were committed to the Torah, but on top of that, were committed to the Torah by Jesus. So if you were to go to Matthew 5:17-20, you'd see what I'm referring to here is that Jesus taught a Torah that was defined by both liberty and perfection. Jesus came to fulfill the law, but he also spend a lot of time reflecting back on the law so that everyone would be able to understand that and continue on as believers in God and see how their life fits into that perspective. The use of forget here, forgetful here, or forget, significant. It's if seen from the Jewish perspective, this is a typical connection as an idea of do not forget the law, do not forget the Torah. Again, as we look back on the history of the people of Israel, the Jewish people, we see that they forgot the law many times and bad things happened to them. They forgot how God intended them to be and had to live out the consequences here. As we wrap up chapter 1, verses 26 and 27 kind of go into a new section dealing with pure religion. And so it's, for the most part, a summary of chapter 1. So let me read verses 26 and 27, and then we will do a quick summary and be done with today. So if anyone thinks himself to be religious and yet does not bridle his tongue but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless. Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained by the world. It's just one example, one really good example of how someone who believes in God or who wants to bring the justice of God to this earth, who wants to live the righteousness of God here on this earth, should live. There are many other examples, but this is an example there of the orphans and widows that James brought to the attention of the community at that time because it was a need that they had. Depending on where you live right now, you may say, well, I know no orphans or no widows, so what do I do? Well, there's about 1 million things you can do in order to fulfill the righteousness and justice of God here on earth. So let's not make that to be a cop-out or to limit what justice and righteousness can look like here, or God's justice and righteousness can look like here on earth. So as we look at this, the poor need to live properly. So there's the idea of speech practices, they need to resist desires, and the power. Here are we see that the works of the doer, the bridling of the tongue, helping those who have been marginalized. A community of holiness is what the expectation is. The beginning of 26 is some similarity to what Paul wrote, an if-then statement from, if you were to go to just some reference points from Galatians 6:3, 1 Corinthians 3:18, 1 Corinthians 10:12. James will cover more of this, kind of this if-then statement that we see here. If anyone thinks himself to be religious and yet does not, and then you have this then that then leads of what the expectations of God is. Paul was really good at that, and so is James, and he's going to cover that a little bit more when we start in chapter 3. But yet he's going to go ahead and bring it to their attention early so they kind of start thinking about it. Even if one appears to be doing good work of faith, it does not matter unless he can restrain from from slanders, lies, blasphemies, other things that can lead to sin. So it's kind of it's the entire package, right? You can go work at the food kitchen. You can go deliver stuff you don't want anymore to Goodwill. You can go on a mission trip, local or international, however you want to do it. But if you are someone who's a slanderer, a gossip, a liar, a blasphemer, those are just actions. It doesn't show where your heart is, and so that's one thing that James is trying to express here, is that those deeds are fine, but where is your heart in that? Are you just doing it to look good on the outside, like you'd say for an Enneagram 3, where if you're really kind of what does it look like for me on the outside? How do people perceive me? That sort of thing. And versus what's inside my heart, and am I doing that to make myself feel good about myself, or am I doing it because I truly want to help people? And so let's think about that. If they want to establish justice, they will keep their temper and mouth under control. Again, is what James is trying to say here. He is keeping the people from violent outbursts that will make their situation even worse. Dealing with hotheads and zealots. As you can imagine, there were a lot then. There are, again, a lot now. So this is why it's so good for us to read James today, is because there's plenty of hotheads and zealots who are saying things that are defeating their entire message that they're trying to give about who God is and who God's righteousness is. So a person may think they are religious. While thinking this, they do not act this way or bridle their tongues, again, being hotheads and zealots. They're choosing to deceive their hearts. And if they do that, their religion is useless. Their testimony in which they live, their witness in which they live is useless. If it is the person's own fault for their own deception. Going back to the Satan comments I was making earlier, Satan doesn't make you a hothead or a zealot. You are a hothead and a zealot on your own, and you need to make a decision if you're going to do that or not. Otherwise, you're deceiving yourself. Again, saying Satan caused that is a cop-out in majority of cases. Deceive goes back to lust that James spoke about earlier. Whenever you see the use of deception here, to indulge their hearts, to live pleasurably, to continue to live the lives that they know that God is. It's not bad to live a good life. That's not at all what James is saying here, but it's one of those things is, where's that balance of righteousness and justice, and are you ignoring the people around you who need help, who need God's justice, who needs God's righteousness, who are possibly being oppressed or hurt or something, and are you just standing by and watching and thinking good things about yourself while other things around you are happening, or people's worlds are falling apart? The uses of worthless kind of is a contrast back to the first fruits that we saw earlier, without fruit, idle, no power. The volatile tongue, again, as we're working through these last two verses of bridle his tongue, the volatile tongue does not bring peace or justice. It's what is referred to as Mateos, which means, for the most part, worthless. Might mean a separation from God, but in context means in the social conditions in which they exist, the establishment of the kingdom of God does not happen in such a violent situation. So a volatile tongue, and so we're going to talk more about the tongue, of course, into chapter 3, but here it causes so much problem. What the words that come out of people's mouths, back then they didn't type things, but the things that people type on social media or other areas, the things that come out of us is that volatility, that evil, that unrighteousness that comes out of us, is everything that James is speaking of here, and it's something that he was dealing with in his community, because he saw it breaking down his community about what a volatile tongue, or volatile, you have to say tongue, fingers, because you're typing it all out, or volatile mind, process of how you perceive and how you communicate and how you reflect on others. As we go into this final verse of chapter 1, Our process to perfection and maturity goes through the ability to be merciful and compassionate. Following rules and moralism does not bring us closer to God. Being merciful and loving is what brings us closer in sight of God. James knows many look religious, and they look religious and good to other people, but in the eyes of God, they are wicked. As we continue on through this, through verse 27, purity is a key concern, as you probably know, for the Jewish people who are raised in the temple time. It is a core concern of the Jewish people, and so something that James, of course, is bringing here to help kind of provide some perspective for the people as they read through this. Like I said, this is an Old Testament reference. People hearing this will be reflecting on clean animals, places, and flesh as discussed in the Torah, and so they kind of understand this viewpoint. James is looking at the Messianic community as a Jewish people who understand the Torah and temple worship, which is why you'll see a lot of Messianic references here. Not Messianic, Jewish references that we may not fully understand unless we understand a better understanding of the Jewish faith tradition. Because of how Jewish James is here. So we have to always be aware of that whenever we read through James. The orphan and the widow, I touched on that briefly, but is of course a key issue that they dealt with in the Old Testament. It's something that's dealt with throughout a New and Old Testament, actually, the idea that the orphan, but if you were, and the widow, so if you turn to, say, Deuteronomy 10, chapter 10, there's some good reference points to that. Other Old Testament legislation that you'd see, say, from Isaiah 10, 17 and surrounding verses was the idea of everything that he is bringing up here that James has brought up through a lot of these past several verses of learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, and plead for the widow. All that is stuff that these people are very familiar with. Many of them had not been doing. The Jewish church or the Jewish people had not been doing for centuries, even no matter what the prophets would say or other leaders would say. And so that was something that they would have to deal with. Should get a new light switch. So as we finish this up today, we're just to strive for holiness. Moral fidelity and compassionate behavior, as we see through James chapter 1. Wisdom, good works, and gentle life. Contrasts with the social disruptance, violence, and arrogance that was going on during that time. And so James is just beginning to kind of show that contrast between what God's intention of wisdom, good works, gentle life, God's righteousness and justice is compared to in the world in which they existed, which was all about social disruption, violence, and arrogance. And fortunately, we don't have any of those things anymore. We have no social disruption, violence, or arrogance. So it's, so how do we put this in perspective with James? Well, we do have all those things, and so this is very applicable to what James was teaching back then, that society has not changed much in regards to human nature and how humans react and interact with each other. So it's something that I would, you take to heart as you read through this. And like I said, there are a lot of Jewish references here, Jewish faith references, that may seem a little vague or off to us, but there's also a lot of wisdom in this first part of this letter, well, through the entire letter, that allows us and provides a guide. So James is like a guidebook to help us as we live lives of wisdom, righteous, and justices. Okay, so that's part 2 of James. We just wrapped up. Next time we start this, we'll start chapter 2 of James and continue on from there. I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.